Is this some kind of joke? The lieutenant's voice, sharp and laced with an arrogance that only youth in a freshly minted rank could produce, echoed unnaturally in the cavernous, climate-controlled space of the drone hangar. He stood with his hands on his hips, his uniform so new it still held the creases from the factory. His gaze was fixed on the old man before him, a man who seemed to shrink inside his red janitor's coveralls. "Do you even know where you are, old man?" Ralph Jennings, 82 years past his first breath, didn't answer. He simply leaned on his wheeled trash bin, his gnarled hands resting on the plastic rim. His eyes, the color of a faded sky, weren't focused on the young officer but on the sleek, deadly Predator drone parked silently in the center of the hangar. He'd seen machines like it before, though they had been cruder, louder, and flown by boys with fear in their eyes. This one was different. It was a ghost, a silent hunter, and he understood its purpose with a clarity that would have terrified the lieutenant. The young officer exchanged an exasperated look with the two airmen who flanked him, their own expressions a mixture of discomfort and practiced neutrality. They were just following orders. "License and registration," the lieutenant snapped, his patience wearing thin. "And get away from the asset. Now." His voice was a whip crack, intended to startle and command. He took a half-step closer, his hand dropping to rest casually, almost theatrically, on the grip of his holstered sidearm. It was a gesture of pure intimidation, a foolish display of power in a place that bristled with more lethal force than a dozen armies. Ralph's gaze slowly drifted from the drone, past the nervous airman, and finally settled on the lieutenant. He didn't flinch, he didn't speak, he just watched, his stillness a stark contrast to the officer's agitated energy. The lieutenant's face tightened, his jaw clenching. He saw a frail, senile janitor who had wandered into a restricted area, a problem to be dealt with swiftly and contemptuously. He couldn't see the decades of discipline etched into the old man's posture, a discipline so deeply ingrained that it had become a quiet state of being. He couldn't interpret the calm in Ralph's eyes, mistaking it for the vacant stare of dementia rather than the patient observation of a man who had faced down threats far greater than a boy in a clean uniform. "Are you deaf?" The lieutenant pressed, his voice rising. "I am placing you under temporary detention for breaching a secure perimeter. You will comply with my orders. Hands where I can see them." The airmen shifted, their unease growing. They had seen Ralph mopping these floors for years, a fixture as reliable as the morning sunrise. He was just the janitor, a quiet, unassuming figure who kept to himself and did his job with a slow, meticulous precision. This felt wrong. The lieutenant, however, was doubling down, caught in the undertow of his own authority. "I said hands where I can see them," he repeated, taking another step forward, his voice now a full-blown shout that carried across the polished concrete floor. The confrontation had started with a simple, misplaced tool bag. Ralph had been finishing his nightly sweep when he noticed it, a standard maintenance kit left dangerously close to the intake of the MQ-9 Reaper. He knew what FOD foreign object debris could do to a turbine engine. Without a second thought, he had shuffled over, his worn-out work boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the floor. He bent down with a slight grunt, picked up the bag and was turning to place it on a designated workbench when the lieutenant, a new transfer to the base's security squadron, had rounded the tail of the drone. He saw not a diligent employee preventing a potential disaster, but an unauthorized civilian touching military hardware. From there, the situation had spiraled. The lieutenant's questions were accusations from the start. "Who are you? What are you doing here? What's your clearance level?" Ralph had tried to explain in his quiet, raspy voice, but the officer wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in asserting his dominance. He had snatched Ralph's simple, laminated facility ID from his coveralls, scoffing at the title, Contract Sanitation. It was a role so lowly in his eyes that it only deepened his suspicion. How could a man like this have access to one of the most advanced pieces of military technology on the planet? Now a small crowd was beginning to form at a respectful distance. A few mechanics and avionics specialists, drawn by the lieutenant's shouting, watched with worried expressions. They knew Ralph. They knew his quiet nods, the way he'd sometimes pause to look at the drones with an unreadable expression, the faint, almost invisible scent of industrial cleaner and old coffee that trailed him. He was a part of the hangar's ecosystem, a ghost in gray who cleaned up their messes without a word of complaint. The lieutenant, emboldened by the audience, puffed out his chest. He was making an example of this old man, demonstrating his own vigilance and commitment to security. "You see this pin?" the lieutenant said, his voice dripping with condescension. He jabbed a finger toward a small, tarnished metal object pinned to the collar of Ralph's coveralls. It was a simple design, barely noticeable against the worn red fabric. "What's this supposed to be? Some souvenir you picked up at the Air and Space Museum?" A little toy to make you feel important. He chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. This is a military installation, Grandpa. We deal in real honors here, not cheap trinkets. He was enjoying himself now, the humiliation of the old man a balm to his own insecurities. He was building his case, constructing a narrative of a doddering old fool who needed to be removed. He gestured to one of the airmen. Get ready to escort him to the security office. We're going to run a full background check. I want to know everything about this man. The airman hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting Ralph's, before a sharp "now" airman from the lieutenant spurred him into reluctant motion. The circle was closing in, the weight of the young officer's authority pressing down on the quiet old man. As the lieutenant's finger touched the worn pin on Ralph's collar, the world for Ralph flickered for just a moment. The bright, sterile light of the hangar dissolved into a searing, dusty sun. The low hum of the drone's electronics was replaced by the deafening rotor wash of a Huey helicopter struggling to lift off from a cratered landing zone. The acrid smell of ozone and jet fuel vanished, replaced by the coppery scent of blood and the thick, choking dust of a place he hadn't allowed himself to remember in years. He saw a hand, young and steady, pinning that same piece of metal to his own sweat-soaked, grime-covered uniform. He heard a voice, gravelly and full of respect, spoken by a commander he had revered. "You don't just get one of these," the commander had said, his words nearly lost in the chaos. "You earn it with blood. Don't ever forget what it cost." The memory was a lightning strike, a flash of fire and thunder that lasted no more than a heartbeat, before the hangar solidified around him once more. The lieutenant was still talking, his face contorted in a sneer, completely oblivious to the ghost of a war hero he was trying to break. Ralph's expression didn't change, but in the depths of his faded blue eyes, a distant fire had been rekindled. Across the hangar, leaning against a massive yellow tool chest, stood Master Sergeant Cole. He was a man who had seen more than his share of arrogant young lieutenants. He was also a man who understood the intricate, often invisible hierarchies of a military base. Hierarchies that had nothing to do with the rank on one's collar. He had been watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of dread. He had always made a point to greet Ralph in the mornings, to ask him how he was doing. There was something about the old janitor, a profound stillness, that Cole recognized. It was the same stillness he'd seen in a handful of operators during his own time in the Special Forces, a calm that came from having walked through hell and finding it survivable. The lieutenant's public humiliation of the old man was a violation of some unspoken code. It was a deep and profound act of disrespect that set every one of Cole's finely tuned instincts on edge. When the lieutenant put his hand near Ralph's collar, mocking the pin, Cole had seen enough. He knew that some things, some symbols, were sacred. Pushing himself off the tool chest, he moved with a quiet urgency, melting into the shadows at the edge of the hangar. He pulled out his personal cell phone, his thumb flying across the screen. He bypassed the chain of command, the squadron leaders, and the operations officers. He had the personal number of the base commander, Colonel Matthews, a privilege reserved for a select few. He knew it was a risk, a serious breach of protocol to call the old man directly over something that, on the surface, seemed like a minor security issue. But his gut, an organ he had learned to trust implicitly over 25 years of service, was screaming at him that this was no minor issue. The phone rang once, twice. Colonel Matthews answered, his voice impatient. "This better be important, Master Sergeant." Cole took a breath, his voice low and steady, making sure no one could overhear. "Sir," he said, "you need to get down to Hangar 4. Now." There was a pause. "What is it, Cole?" "It's Lieutenant Miller, sir. He's detaining one of the contract janitors." "A janitor?" The colonel's voice was thick with annoyance. "And you're calling my personal cell for that?" "Sir," Cole said, choosing his next words carefully, "the janitor's name is Ralph Jennings." Colonel Matthews was in his office, a spacious room with walls adorned with commendations and photographs of him with stern-faced generals, when Master Sergeant Cole's call came in. He had been in the middle of reviewing logistics reports, his mind a whirlwind of fuel requisitions and sortie schedules. The name Ralph Jennings cut through the noise like a sniper's bullet. For a moment the colonel said nothing. The name echoed in the silence of his office, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over a decade, a name that was the stuff of hushed legends and classified after-action reports read only by those with the highest security clearances. "Say that name again, Master Sergeant," Matthews commanded, his voice suddenly stripped of all its earlier annoyance. He was already on his feet, his chair pushed back so hard it scraped against the polished floor. "Jennings, sir. Ralph Jennings," Cole repeated. "He's an old man, sir. Works as a janitor here." The colonel felt a cold dread wash over him. He strode to his desk, his eyes scanning a row of secure direct-line phones. This was a catastrophic failure. How had a man like Ralph Jennings been allowed to work in quiet anonymity, mopping floors? How had his own command been so blind? "Keep him there, Cole," the colonel ordered, his voice now a low, urgent growl. "Do not, under any circumstances, let that lieutenant take him anywhere. Am I clear?" "Crystal, sir," Cole replied. The line went dead. Colonel Matthews slammed the phone down and bellowed for his aide. "Get my car, and get the honor guard, full dress uniform. Now, move." The aide, a young captain, stared, bewildered by the sudden explosion of activity. He had never seen the colonel like this. It was as if the base had just gone to its highest alert level. "Sir, what's the occasion?" he stammered. The colonel was already shrugging on his service jacket, his face a mask of grim determination. "The occasion, Captain," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of fury and awe, "is that we have a living legend in our hangar, and we have been letting him clean our toilets." Back in the hangar, the lieutenant's arrogance had reached its zenith. He was completely unaware of the storm that was about to break over his head. Ralph's silence, his refusal to be baited or intimidated, had only infuriated him further. He interpreted it as insolence, a silent rebellion that needed to be crushed. "That's it, I'm done with this," he declared, pulling a pair of zip-tie restraints from his belt. "You are being detained as a potential security threat. Your refusal to cooperate will be noted in my report." He gestured again to the airman. "Escort him. If he resists, use necessary force." The airman exchanged another nervous glance. "Use force on the 82-year-old janitor." The order was absurd, but it was a direct order. One of them took a hesitant step toward Ralph. The lieutenant smirked, a cruel, triumphant look on his face. He was in control. He was the authority. He was about to make a definitive statement about the importance of security protocols on his base. He was going to put this old man in his place, and in doing so elevate his own status in the eyes of his superiors. He had no idea that he was not just ending his career, he was about to become an infamous footnote in the history of the base, a cautionary tale told to new officers for generations to come about the dangers of hubris and the hidden valor of unassuming men. Just as the airman reached out a reluctant hand toward Ralph's arm, a deep, powerful rumble filled the air. It wasn't the sound of a jet engine, it was the sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed. The massive bay doors of the hangar, which had been closed, began to slide open with a loud metallic groan, flooding the cavernous space with the bright afternoon sun. Silhouetted against the light was a convoy of black official vehicles, led by the base commander's staff car, its flags fluttering. They screeched to a halt on the tarmac just outside the hangar, doors flying open before the wheels had even stopped spinning. Colonel Matthews emerged from the lead car, his face like thunder. He was followed by the base command chief master sergeant, and a full 14-man honor guard, their dress blues immaculate, their white gloves stark against the gray concrete. The sight was so unexpected, so overwhelmingly official, that it stunned the entire hangar into silence. The mechanics and specialists froze, their tools hanging forgotten in their hands. The lieutenant and his two airmen stood as if turned to stone, their petty drama instantly rendered insignificant by the arrival of the base's entire command structure. This wasn't a response, it was a display of overwhelming force, a spectacle of honor and authority that the hangar, a simple workshop for the machines of war, had never before witnessed. Colonel Matthews strode into the hangar, his footsteps echoing like hammer blows in the sudden, complete silence. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, swept past the gawking onlookers and the terrified lieutenant as if they weren't even there. He walked directly to the old man in the red coveralls. He stopped precisely 3 feet in front of him, his posture ramrod straight. For a moment he simply looked at Ralph, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief, reverence, and profound regret. Then, in a motion so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, Colonel Matthews snapped to the most rigid position of attention and rendered a salute. It wasn't a casual greeting. It was a salute of profound, almost reverential respect, the kind a soldier gives to a head of state or a Medal of Honor recipient. "Mr. Jennings," the colonel's voice boomed, filled with an emotion that no one present had ever heard from him before. "It is an honor, sir." The lieutenant's jaw went slack. The airman's eyes were as wide as dinner plates. The colonel turned his head slightly, his gaze now falling upon the assembled personnel. "For those of you who do not know," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hangar, "you are in the presence of Chief Master Sergeant Ralph Jennings, retired. He is one of the founding members of the Air Force's Para-Rescue Service. He was a pioneer in combat search and rescue. During his 26 years of service, he conducted over 100 combat rescue missions, from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan." The colonel paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He then looked directly at the lieutenant, his eyes narrowing. That cheap trinket on his collar, Lieutenant, is the Air Force Cross, our nation's second highest award for valor in combat. He was awarded it for actions during the Sun Tae raid, a mission so secret most of you have never even heard of it. The crowd of onlookers gasped. They weren't just looking at a janitor anymore. They were looking at a hero, a living piece of history, who had been walking silently among them all along. The colonel turned his full, undivided attention to the lieutenant. The young officer seemed to shrink under the weight of the commander's gaze, his face having gone from a confident smirk to a mask of pale, sickly dread. "Lieutenant Miller," the colonel began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouting. "You stand here in a hangar that houses the pinnacle of modern air power, and you fail to recognize the man who wrote the book on extracting pilots from behind enemy lines. You, who have never heard a shot fired in anger, chose to publicly humiliate a man who has more courage in his little finger than you have in your entire body." The lieutenant opened his mouth to speak, to stammer out an excuse, but the colonel cut him off. "You are an embarrassment to that uniform, to your rank, and to every man and woman serving on this base. Your disrespect is a stain on my command." The words were like physical blows. The lieutenant wilted, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a frightened, chastened young man. Just as the colonel seemed poised to deliver a final, career-ending blow, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Colonel." All eyes turned to Ralph. He had straightened up slightly, his hands no longer leaning on the trash bin. He looked at the colonel, then at the humiliated lieutenant. "The boy made a mistake," Ralph said, his voice calm and even. "He was trying to do his job. He was just a little too proud about it." He then looked directly at Lieutenant Miller, his faded eyes holding not malice but a quiet, profound wisdom. "Son," he said gently, "the most important thing you can wear with that uniform isn't the rank on your shoulder, it's humility. Remember that." The simple words, delivered with grace instead of anger, landed with more force than any reprimand. As Ralph spoke, the image of the small, tarnished pin flashed once more in his mind. This time, the memory was clearer. He was on his knees in the mud, the chaos of a failed rescue mission raging around him. A young pilot, his leg shattered, was bleeding out. Enemy fire was raking their position. Ralph had shielded the pilot with his own body while his hands, sure and steady, worked to stop the bleeding. It was then that his commander, Major Evans, had been hit. In his dying moments, Evans had pulled the pin from his own collar. "You're the bravest man I've ever known, Ralph," he had gasped, pressing the pin into his hand. "Wear it for all the boys we couldn't bring home." It wasn't an official award, it was something more. It was a battlefield commission of valor, a transfer of honor from a dying man to the one who fought to save him. The official Air Force Cross had come later, in a quiet ceremony, but this pin, the one the lieutenant had mocked, was the one that truly mattered. It was a reminder not of glory, but of cost. The fallout from the incident in Hangar 4 was swift and decisive. Lieutenant Miller was formally reprimanded and immediately transferred to a desk job at a remote logistics base in the Arctic, a place where his opportunities for arrogant displays of authority would be severely limited. Before he left, Colonel Matthews made it mandatory for him to attend a one-on-one history lesson with the base historian, focusing on the Sun Tae raid and the origins of Air Force special warfare. Furthermore, the colonel instituted a new base-wide initiative called Valor in Our Midst, a program designed to identify and honor the surprisingly large number of veterans working in civilian contract positions on the base. Their stories, once hidden, were now shared in the base newspaper and at commanders' calls, a constant reminder of the quiet professionalism and hidden heroism that surrounded the active duty personnel every day. About a month later, a humbled and much quieter ex-lieutenant was in a local grocery store picking out a carton of milk when he saw a familiar figure in the next aisle. It was Ralph Jennings, calmly comparing two brands of canned soup. For a moment, Miller considered turning and walking away, but the old man's words about humility echoed in his mind. He walked over, his heart pounding. "Mr. Jennings," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Ralph looked up, his expression unreadable. I wanted to apologize for my behavior. There's no excuse for it." Ralph studied the young man's face for a long moment, then simply nodded. "Apology accepted, son," he said, before turning his attention back to the soup. "Just remember the lesson. The forgiveness, offered so simply, was both a release and a lifelong burden for the young man to carry." Ralph went home, his act of quiet grace unseen by anyone else, a final private lesson from a man who was a hero, not because of the medal he wore, but because of the man he was. Thank you for joining us for this story on veteran valor. If you were moved by the quiet heroism of Ralph Jennings, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.